Hi, everyone. Welcome to this event hosted by the Work on Climate community. For those of you unfamiliar with Work on Climate, we are the world's largest climate-oriented community focused on demystifying climate work and on helping people transition into climate-oriented work. And today, we have with us Todd Bush, who is the executive director at decarbonfuse, which covers daily decarbonization news and analysis across sectors. And Todd is going to speak with us today about industrial decarbonization, and he's going to give us a primer into the state of this space. Thank you for joining us today, Todd.
Great, thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. I definitely appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully I can point out some opportunities and basically see what is exciting about kind of industrial decarbonization and kind of what that means. And if you have any questions as we are going through, I've kind of laid out hopefully maybe 20-30 minutes of content, but at the end I'm excited about kind of having a little bit more of a discussion and hopefully can point some people in the right direction. So I would say over the last probably the last year, I've been to approximately 10 or 12 different energy, climate tech, kind of low carbon events. And I think one thing that seems to be a common thread is hiring and finding people is one of the key challenges that many of these companies are trying to face. And obviously that means bringing new talent to their respective kind of companies and industries, finding opportunities for advancement within those companies, and then obviously retaining the people they have. And I started decarbonfuse with the focus of kind of solving industrial decarbonization through kind of carbon capture, hydrogen, electrification of operations, and carbon removal intelligence. So a lot of insights and information around kind of who the investors are, who the asset owners are, and then of course all the supporting organizations around those companies. And so right now we have a handful of people that I reach out to that are experts in carbon markets, experts in chemical engineering. We do a lot of different projects for kind of commercial carbon capture, hydrogen evaluation, and things like that. So excited to take this opportunity and share a little bit about industrial decarbonization. So I'm going to start off kind of the talk, just like a little primer on what it is and what that really means, showcase a few of the net zero scenarios that I see kind of coming up time and again, and then talk about the size of a handful of different markets, because when you generally think of energy and industrial kind of processes, a lot of people will tend to think of, and I know I fall into this, I tend to think of one type of company, and there are so many different types of companies serving these markets. And then I'm going to spend the most kind of majority of my time in kind of these four kind of key solution areas, and then just leave it open for questions and kind of next steps towards the end. So I'll point back to the Department of Energy a couple different times during this talk, but industrial decarbonization is really phasing out the emissions from the industrial sector. That's kind of the short and the quick point to it, but essentially looking at how do we reduce CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and any other types of gases from energy and industrial processes. So depending on the kind of the data you're looking at, usually it's 25 to 35% of emissions from the US are coming from industrial processes. And then hopefully you've seen Net Zero America's kind of emission scenarios, but I like pointing back to this because it gives kind of a good starting point, a good kind of reference case of where we are right now. And obviously that's going to be heavy on natural gas and coal and diesel and gasoline as key kind of sources of emissions. And then what the Net Zero America does is essentially lay out a couple different scenarios for heavy electrification, maybe a heavy electrification, but kind of a renewable constrained scenario, and then a 100% renewable, 100% electrification, and what that can do to the emissions, and then I'll say kind of a low electrification scenario lastly on the right. And so regardless of which scenario you kind of cling on to, I think there's a real opportunity to take a look at the industrial processes and think about what can be done from a natural gas kind of input, or what can be done from a feedstock, or you'll hear of kind of diesel or gas, or even some of the other products that are being used. And then of course I'll hit on kind of the sequestration side. So I believe, so these are only 4 of the scenarios that Net Zero America has. I believe there's a handful of others, but these 3 out of these 4 use sequestration. So essentially taking that CO2 out of the air, capturing it and putting it underground in either a reservoir or a saline aquifer, so that it is put away and kind of removed from the atmosphere. So those are some interesting kind of scenarios. And as we think about kind of the emitters, obviously I mentioned kind of the industrial emitters are quite large when you think of them from both a footprint size, from an emission footprint, and also kind of revenue. And we went back and looked at about 335 public kind of energy companies, industrial companies that are all listed in the NASDAQ or NYSE for in the US, and took the size of their kind of 2021 revenue just to get an idea of what we're talking about. And so this is 4.6 trillion in revenue for 2021. So again, that's not market cap, that's not earnings, it's they're kind of the top line. And so energy is the largest portion of that. Obviously that's going to include the large energy and oil and gas companies like Exxon and Chevron. It's going to include equipment companies, the oil and gas and chemical, or I should say oil and gas refineries are big in there, like Marathon and ConocoPhillips. That's the biggest portion. And then as you move into kind of this industrial side, then you have others that are around the industrial machinery, construction machinery, even kind of air logistics, and then any of the industrial conglomerates. So think of companies like GE or Honeywell, or even Caterpillar. So Caterpillar is a great one, especially today. So Caterpillar announced today they're delivering on the first fully electrified mining equipment for, I don't know the client, but they're delivering that and announcing that today. So obviously a lot of interesting things happening in the industrials, in the machinery space. And then as you go around this kind of wheel, have chemicals, and chemicals, the large piece of the overall revenue piece, but you have specialty chemicals, diversified chemicals. There's going to be companies in here like Chemour and maybe who else? There's other large chemical companies, maybe some like DuPont would be another large one, and they're taking up a big piece. In I'll mention some of the fertilizer and ag companies later in the presentation, but they're kind of in this chemicals piece as well. And then moving into materials, the red, where you have a sizable portion there with aluminum and steel and some forest products and precious metals and mining. So you can think of the companies in this space like BHP, US Steel, Nucor. Those are like big enterprises. And then moving into utilities, where you're kind of utility provider, but some of the larger ones in the US, companies like Dominion, Duke Energy, National Grid, those are all large kind of public companies. So each one of these sectors is moving towards sustainability goals that they have. So whether that's energy, industrials, chemicals, materials, they're all focused right now on how do we reach our net zero goals, or maybe they have carbon neutral goals. And we took out some of the public E&Ps that were setting their sights on net zero, and found only a handful had no targets, and primarily most were kind of this carbon neutral and net zero. So these are companies like Oxy and EOG Resources and others that are basically within oil and gas, but are moving broadly into other kind of energy segments. So essentially 80% of those companies have targets. And when we started looking at the budgets, about 10 to 25% of their capital was going towards reaching those sustainability targets. So if you pulled out the utilities would look even better from a standpoint of probably 85 to 90% of utilities have net zero targets, and several others from the chemical and material side are advancing their kind of net zero targets in their capital pretty aggressively. All right, so 4 key kind of solutions that I get to kind of explore and talk about today. So I'm going to move through the first 2 pretty quickly: energy efficiency and electrification of operations, then move into hydrogen and carbon capture. And essentially, I think last year and this year, we've seen finally this turning point with enterprises really looking at putting their capital to work to become more efficient, become more electrified in their operations. And so I do want a quick caveat of when think of electrification, not necessarily thinking, and I'm not including in this scenario, but you could include kind of electrifying their fleet of cars. But I'm going to be focused companies measuring their electricity consumption and where is that electricity coming from, and then what can they do to maybe have a unique approach to let's say create power from waste, or to have some new, say, pressure to power or some opportunity like that where they can generate power from some waste product. And so when I look at some of the energy efficiency companies, I tend to categorize several on the left-hand side. They're more kind of software-based. So Invisi, Industrial, Amperon, those are all companies that are going to help you measure decarbonization and really focus on scope 2. So Industrial is an interesting company. They have software. It's used in hundreds of facilities, and they're hiring for, I believe, software engineers, as well as kind of marketing and sales roles. But they measure the carbon intensity of your electricity for that individual facility, and then kind of roll it up so that plant managers, organizations can see at any level how their carbon intensity looks like, and what those projected kind of greenhouse gases would I'll say kind of would be modeled, and then they can align those to specific goals that they have for the corporate level, so they can kind of roll those facilities up and get a better understanding. Let's see, on kind of more the waste heat to power, there's several very interesting companies that have raised them, I'll say, seed and Series A rounds. One is Canaan Energy. They're hiring for, I believe, engineering and kind of project, I'll say kind of project management roles, where they're basically helping companies decarbonize their operations by taking any waste product, any waste heat, and converting that to power. So that's something that they're doing actively with customers. And then another group called Pressure Corp. This is another company that is really focused on taking kind of using pressure from an existing industrial system and then creating some power from that. So they, I believe, are hiring for kind of engineering roles and sales roles as well. And then you may have heard of Antoro Energy. Their company, I believe Breakthrough Energy is backing them. They're hiring, have quite a few roles for engineering and business development. but they're basically creating kind of low carbon power and heat with this kind of unique thermal approach, and then also storing some of that energy. And then for the electrification of operations, this can be anything for taking new types of equipment, hybrid systems, dual fuel systems, using battery storage kind of on site. One company that's doing some pretty unique things is called Mainspring Energy. They have a linear generator. They're hiring for hundreds of engineering, sales, and probably even some kind of product type of roles. Mainspring is pretty aggressive in getting out and replacing some of the, I'll say, older generators that are on site at many of these facilities. And then a couple of corporates that I wanted to include in here, since they're actually doing some of these and rolling out some of these hybrid systems. Companies like CEMEX and Cliffs are taking battery energy storage at the site and trying to use that as, I'll say, backup and to improve reliability. And then Current Power is one of those providers that's providing some of the battery energy storage systems. And Manpower is another company, Manpower Energy Solutions, I believe the full name. They have a whole lineup of electrical equipment that's replacing some of the diesel and natural gas equipment that is typically on site at some of these older facilities. So that's my quick kind of run through for the efficiency and electrification side. For hydrogen, I'm going to dig in a little deeper and give you a lot more companies to kind of look at. So there's a lot of people that are very excited about just hydrogen and this kind of hydrogen economy that is just now getting started. So if you're looking at kind of 2020, there's probably 80 to 90 million tons of hydrogen kind of per year that's produced. The expectation is that that's the majority gray hydrogen. If you don't know what gray hydrogen is, or curious about some of these colors, gray hydrogen is typically created from natural gas or methane or some steam reforming process. The lower carbon, the blue hydrogen, is typically created from a similar process, but then you're sequestering or using the CO2 that's generated from that process. And then renewable or green hydrogen is basically coming from electrolysis, so water and renewable energy, then producing hydrogen. And there are a number of companies, but I just want to point out that hydrogen today is, I would say a mid-sized market. It's not huge, but there's a number of opportunities, whether you're talking about using hydrogen as fuel, like they do right now in California. So you'll see hydrogen used as fuel at some of the ports in California, whether it's more kind of mobility, more on the consumer side, or if it's used for feedstock into other industrial processes. So basically kind of replacing some of the natural gas and diesel and other products that might be used for input. And then of course, being able to use hydrogen to power, to use and turn into power. So a lot of kind of exciting opportunities that that hydrogen can kind of offer to the entire energy system. So there's this emerging hydrogen value chain that is touching many different aspects of the economy. So I've used kind of this value chain from Energy Capital Ventures, but you can kind of see the breakdown of kind of production on the left, storage and transport in the middle, and this consumption on the right-hand side, and this bottom kind of layer of other services, logistics, software, things like that at the bottom. Just to kind of highlight a couple of these companies, like Cemvita Factory is producing hydrogen by using basically creating gold hydrogen from old oil wells. There's Omnium, who's looking at green hydrogen and producing that. You probably have heard maybe a little bit about Monolith. They're a company that's building some pretty large facilities in the Midwest and I believe Nebraska area. Moat is another kind of hydrogen company in California that is using kind of biomass and producing hydrogen for kind of the Californian market. And they're also doing a little bit of CO2 sequestration in there as well. And Charm Industrial is another company where they have a kind of a bio oil product, but also looking and developing hydrogen from kind of the production side. From the storage and transportation, this is one that will continue to evolve, but you can obviously move hydrogen in most likely a liquid or gas form. But there's many companies that are looking at kind of modular kind of techniques to do that, especially if you look at kind of aviation as an end use potential. And there's a couple, Zero Avia, and I believe there's another universal hydrogen that is looking at kind of aviation side as well. From just a couple of other services, just to highlight Lift H2, which is essentially a Boston company that's trying to build out the entire hydrogen supply chain. And so they're doing that with some of these companies on this value chain, as well as some of the large companies that are looking to expand kind of the hydrogen market. And others like Phoenix Hydrogen, I think, is the Y Combinator company, and they're looking at building a marketplace as well as building some infrastructure. So actually doing a little bit of both. So pretty exciting time, and a lot of these companies have raised money and are moving to kind of scale their operations, basically going from one pilot or proven kind of concept into a larger scale. I want to just put this out because there is an existing market for hydrogen, although it's much more focused on just the feedstock part of that. So you'll have production coming from Air Products, Air Liquide, and Plug Power are probably the primary producers right now. And then from kind of the storage and transport side, you have a few companies in there, Linde and Technip, and then several of the utility companies in California that are participating in that. So Pacific, PG&E and SoCal Gas are others. And then a handful of the large consumers right today, obviously not expected to stay this way by any means, but some of those larger consumers are some of the refineries and the chemical companies that are bringing that into bringing hydrogen into their processes as kind of an input. And so that leaves me with about 5 minutes just to cover the carbon capture side. So if you recall on that kind of net zero scenario, I looked at the CO2 sequestration being able to go from basically zero where we are today to somewhere in between, we'll call it 800 million to kind of almost 2 gigatons sequestered, depending on the scenario that you're looking at. So the dark green is that electrification plus scenario versus one where it's electrification plus a kind of constrained renewable. And so whichever way you look at the sequestration side, there's going to be a heavy demand for whether that's industrial or we'll say whether that's carbon capture and storage or direct air capture. Either one, there's going to be some sequestration required as companies really start thinking and figuring out how to build out the kind of the utilization side of this as well. So one piece that we've looked at pretty extensively are the number of projects happening with carbon capture as well as direct air capture. And so those blue icons on the map are all carbon capture. The purple are the direct air capture. And even just in the last 2 weeks, we should be adding another direct air capture site in Texas. So it's something that will be continuously evolving as these companies go from an individual kind of, we'll say, early concept to beginning to build out their plans. So As we think about some of the facilities, one of the reasons that this gets a lot of people excited in the industrial space is that in 24 and 25 and 26, there are about 50 to 70 facilities that are supposed to come online. So that's carbon capture and direct air capture. And now, if you're looking at that from a equipment company perspective or an engineering perspective or any other kind of service provider, then that presents a huge opportunity, and that means a lot of jobs for each of these facilities as well as the companies that support them. So there's no doubt there's going to be a little bit of a bottleneck, and I think just being in kind of the energy and mining space for quite a while, I know that when we start looking out 3, 5, and 7 years, that most likely not all of these projects will come online, and not all of them will actually move from a concept to an investment decision to actually building it out. But there's a great opportunity there for people to get involved with direct air capture and carbon capture right now. And looking at kind of a breakout in a similar way, just looking at this kind of value chain. So on the left-hand side, you have capture and transport. And in the middle, there's this other kind of transport and utilization, which I want to draw a little bit of attention to. And then kind of storage on the right-hand side. And with the kind of supporting organizations, there are many kind of EPC or engineering, procurement, and construction companies, as well as other services, other equipment, G&G, or I should say kind of geological services or steel, that kind of are required to build out these huge facilities. And when you think about kind of carbon capture and direct air capture, I've heard a lot of different numbers thrown out, but you can think the small carbon capture facilities are probably $500 to $700 million each. The larger facilities, and many of the announcements that are being made by the Climeworks and Heirloom and Oxy and others that are building out these larger facilities, are really looking at kind of $1 billion facility, and some of those are potentially up to about 2.5 billion, depending on kind of the size that they want to ultimately get to. So on the capture side, like mentioned, Climeworks, carbon capture, Cozero, Oxy, many of these companies are looking for chemical engineers as well as mechanical engineers and people to manage the project from kind of beginning to end. On the transport side, there's a big opportunity for pipeline construction. So right now, there's a company called Navigator CO2 and Summit Carbon Solutions that are looking at building out 2,000 to 3,000 miles of CO2 pipelines to be able to connect kind of the ethanol facilities in the Midwest to storage sites in North Dakota and in Wyoming. And then other companies on this utilization track are looking at, okay, we're going to begin capturing this CO2. So what can we do with it? What products can we make from it? Can we create new feedstock? Can we take kind of CO2 and use it for different chemicals, different inputs? And there are companies like LanzaTech, who's now public, as well as Cemvita again, and 12, and carbon upcycling that are moving this from kind of test stages in the lab to actually demonstrating that they can produce other products from this captured CO2. And then on the storage side, that's going to be mostly, I'll say mostly companies that are traditionally oil and gas companies that have the rights and lease rights to be able to store CO2 in different areas. And then the EPC companies, there's a whole host of EPC companies that are large, basically are consulting on these projects, doing the front end engineering and design, all the way to this kind of investment decision. And most of these EPCs that I've listed here are pretty large kind of public companies, but there are a handful of companies that are staying focused on the low carbon space, like Nexus PMG is a good example of that, where they're competing against some of the larger EPCs, but they're actually focused on biomass facilities and small carbon point source kind of capture facilities versus some of these other companies that are looking at just the large projects. So, and it's the kind of the wrap on the carbon capture value chain. So what's next? I hope this was kind of a good kind of primer, kind of 101 on some of these companies that are likely, either hiring or going to be hiring very soon as some of the markets begin taking off with hydrogen and carbon capture, as well as the electrification side. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And you can check out the companies, most of these companies on decarbonfuse.com/companies, where you have some of their facilities, as well as some of the net zero targets. And then just want to, just that last point again that I started with. It's been like every single conference I feel like has been talking about this talent kind of risk and difficulty finding people. And so if you begin researching one of these companies, and have any questions or potentially I can make some introductions, I'm happy to do that. And I'll just I'll stop there and turn it back over and we can answer some questions.
Thanks, Todd. That was very insightful, and thank you for your kind offer to connect folks to these jobs as well. We can open the floor for questions from the audience. We already have a couple that we can address, but if any of you have questions, feel free to put it into the chat or raise your hand if you would like to ask it yourself, and I can call upon you. The first question, Todd, that we have is, you mentioned this talent risk that companies are dealing with. What kind of folks are considered as talent by the industry, and what kind of competition are these companies dealing with to attract that talent?
Yeah. So I can give a couple specific examples because I think that would hopefully that'll help. One thing that's going on with carbon capture specifically is that it had this, we'll call it kind of a boom in the kind of 2000s, maybe 2010s, and then it kind of subsided and really many people kind of went away. So the companies that are actively pursuing carbon capture, direct air capture, are looking for anyone with a chemical engineering background, as well as I would say have any experience with kind of project management. Project management from the side of we have a major capital project that we have to go from the initial start all the way to a design stage and to investment decisions, and then actually build it out. And so those are a lot of the kind of project roles that I'll reference and kind of refer back to, because these are very large individual projects.
Got it. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And just on that same vein, there's a question from Kyle around what is the interest in middle management expertise for these types of companies? Is it dependent on the size of the companies? And I'll kind of add a bit more to that, which is a common question that people often have. What advice would you have for people in the middle of their career who are trying to make a switch into this space and who might not have had direct experience within the space? Any advice for them as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing, especially if you're coming from a marketing background or sales background or engineering background or software background, whatever your background might be focused on today, I would look back at those projects and look back at your experience and be able to kind of translate those to kind of some, I'll say, challenges that companies are having right now. So for example, many of the companies that I mentioned in the industrial space are not great marketing companies, right? There's only a few that everyone knows, right? Maybe companies like GE or maybe Caterpillar or maybe maybe just a couple others. But when it comes from coming from that marketing and sales perspective, I think you can definitely make that leap. From specific engineering roles, I think that may be a little bit of a challenge if you don't have that experience. But I find, at least talking with people right now, they're looking for individuals that are not only have some of the education, but that have the curiosity and the interest to figure out some of these solutions, because it's not a cookie cutter solution yet. And so that curiosity goes a long ways when you're kind of talking to some of the hiring people in this space.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Switching topics slightly, you mentioned these targets earlier that a lot of the corporates have. How many of these targets are in line with the pace that the IPCC recommends to achieve the 1.5 or 2 degrees target?
So there are, let's see, I'm trying to remember, I don't have an exact number on kind of the science-based targets on some of these companies, but definitely what I recall looking at some of the utility companies, especially, I think the utility companies right now in the US are very aggressive in what they're doing. They see the demand and the pull for renewable energy, and you're seeing a lot of these companies that have had success in especially in Europe coming to the US. And I'm thinking of kind of one in particular. Ørsted is one in particular that is building out some of the offshore wind leases on the East Coast. And I've heard that they're now looking at developing the Gulf Coast. And I don't think anything is available yet on the West Coast, but people are anticipating that. And so they're building out kind of offshore wind, and their hope is to bring their emission target in check with that renewable energy. And then there's a few others that are, I would say, using the science-based targets, but many that I looked at from kind of the industrial and the mining side were really probably more focused with just kind of net zero by 2050. And then one piece that I thought was really interesting were some of the chemical companies that had net zero targets by kind of 2030. And that's heavily dependent on basically this transition from natural gas to hydrogen. And so using hydrogen as the low carbon, lower emission kind of solution.
Got it. And so I'm working predominantly in the regenerative agriculture space, and I know that a lot of the ambitious targets that were made maybe a few years ago, they're starting to be adjusted now as that 2030 year starts getting closer. Are you seeing trends like that? Are these companies honing in on exactly what those targets need to be? Do you see any of that movement?
I haven't seen too much movement yet. I definitely have seen more projects being announced to be able to order, kind of make that order of magnitude shift from an emission perspective. So there have been a couple that I think are really focused on scope 1, and then obviously those scope 1 solutions tend to be, at least for a lot of these industrial, around carbon capture, potentially around hydrogen, and changing out equipment. So as mentioned, I think one of them, Canaan Energy, is a good example of this, where they're set to be at this kind of stage where they can help decarbonize and bring finance to the kind of the table to deliver those projects and reduce kind of scope 1 emissions with using kind of a new power source, if you will. I think there's a few others that are pretty excited about being able to reduce scope 2 emissions. So, like as I mentioned, connecting the dots back to the electricity provider, and then buying, being a buyer of low carbon kind of intensity electricity, and then measuring that all the way through at the different facilities, I think will be should be a great kind of opportunity for those companies to at least realize portions of their goals for, whether that's 25 or 30 or 35 and 40. So definitely see the steps in there happening.
Excellent. Any questions from the audience? Feel free to put it into the chat. I do have another one for you, Todd, in the meantime.
Sure.
Are there any differences when you look at this space globally between, different regulatory environments that are creating any interesting dynamics for you, like perhaps in the EU compared to the US, compared to Asia Pacific, and so forth?
Yes. Yeah. So right now, obviously, with the passing of the IRA, it's kind of swung back a little bit to the US, but definitely starting to see Australia and other Asia Pacific countries adopt hydrogen and trying to be and position themselves as a key kind of producer of hydrogen, which is pretty fascinating. And then obviously in Europe, from my opinion, it still feels like the UK and Europe are maybe a step ahead from hydrogen production and carbon capture, and even some of the electrification kind of discussion. There have been, obviously, with the energy security concerns through this winter, I think there's been a number of changes that have maybe caused a little bit of a step back in some countries, but I still think they're a little bit ahead of the US and Canada. And then from South America, there's a lot of things happening in South America from an electrification standpoint. So not just on the industrial side, but also consumer incentives. Definitely some interesting things happening there from how people are, I guess, that mobility side and how people are getting around. That goes a little bit outside of the industrial side, but it's always interesting to watch.
Yeah, excellent. So we do want to do some breakouts to allow people to, reflect upon all the information that you presented, and we can go into that in just a second. So, folks, if you would like to be part of that, hang around after we wrap up. I do have one final question for you. What drives your interest in this space? We never really spoke about, how you first got into this, or, what's driving your passion for decarbonization.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I've been in this space for a long time. It just happened to be at an energy company that I was doing some carbon, I'll say, carbon solutions, basically measuring and monitoring emissions. And then when I left, I got some exposure to some of the companies that were doing electrification at a mine site. And it just kind of fascinated me. And I would definitely recommend, as people begin maybe looking at some of these companies, I've always enjoyed getting out into kind of the field and going to a facility and going to a plant and seeing kind of the operations. I don't have necessarily an engineering background, but it's one where I can kind of appreciate kind of the complexity of it all. And it's always fascinated me. And basically, I kind of look at the world as, or my viewpoint, I guess, is we have to somehow figure out how to continue producing energy, but in a sustainable way. And I think all of that revolves around kind of collaboration and working together and finding these kind of unique solutions that are in different parts of the world, honestly. So it just keeps me focused and keeps me kind of interested in what's going on.
Excellent. Yeah, and we do have a couple more questions actually coming in the meantime. So there's one from Mary. In reference to your CO2 sequestration forecast, how do you expect other carbon removal technology approaches will meet the demand compared to DAC?
So this is a great question. So there are a handful of different carbon capture, carbon removal technologies right now. I think there's essentially one that's kind of, I'll say, or maybe 2 to 3 that are kind of proven, that have been shown to work kind of in the lab at the facility, and actually capturing thousands but not millions of tons yet. I think the CO2 sequestration side, both from the direct air capture and the individual kind of point source capture, I think one thing that is becoming clear, and I suspect in the next year we're going to find out how accurate this statement is, but I think right now it's easier and more straightforward for companies to develop point source capture and not go into a big kind of hub model. And so with the large carbon capture, whether it's a DAC or a big CCUS hub, those are probably billion to $2 billion projects that take anywhere from 18 to 24 months to probably complete. The smaller point source capture, I think, has, at least from the sequestration side, maybe they won't sequester, a gigaton scale, but it will help prove out kind of the technology, both from the sequestration side as well as the utilization side. So I hope that kind of answered the question. And if I didn't, feel free to message me.
Yeah, Marianne, if you have a follow-up, you can put it in the chat as well. So Kyle asked, Todd, would you say that there is a shift in the oil and gas industry to being all in on climate change work?
I definitely think there's a shift. I don't feel like it's all in quite yet. One thing that there are leaders that are doing some very interesting things. So I would point anyone to kind of Oxy. Obviously they're an oil and gas company, but they are doing some interesting things in direct air capture and trying to do some kind of new work there. I think the larger, what people would generally think of as kind of the larger oil and gas companies, like the majors, are definitely making that shift happen, and they're going to make larger moves, bigger investments. Companies like Chevron purchased a large kind of renewable natural gas company. I think BP did the same thing. So I feel like those companies are gonna buy some of the larger kind of low carbon solutions and begin piecing kind of the solutions together, if that makes sense. And then within the industry, I know quite a few. Obviously, I'm in. I don't know if I said this, but I'm in Houston, Texas. So there are quite a few people here that are moving, that I know are in work on climate and work on that are working on emission reduction technologies and tools. And so I think there's more and more every day that are taking the shift to, from oil and gas to broader energy and even broader kind of industrial.
Excellent. There's another question around the circular economy. What are the opportunities within the circular economy and industrial symbiosis, for instance, sharing waste, heat, and materials between these organizations?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of companies that are looking into this. I'm trying to remember who is partnering. Somebody's partnering with Canaan on basically trying to take one facility's waste heat to be able to use that power at another facility. So even though the one facility doesn't have a need for it, they're actually trying to partner with another one and deliver that. And I believe there's especially when you start looking at kind of these clusters of activity. So if you looked at a map, you can see in the Midwest a lot of ethanol facilities. There's definitely an opportunity there for companies to basically kind of share the load, if you will, and then also kind of reuse some of the existing heat and power to be able to make a kind of a difference in their footprint and their profile. Others along in, let's say, kind of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, there's a pretty interesting use case for essentially taking any of the materials that are common across. And so there's a couple of logistics companies that are becoming more of logistics and recycling, which I find kind of interesting. So they're taking some of the unused kind of steel and equipment and trying to then be a kind of recycling center within that industrial park. So I think there's even more opportunity as people start looking at that to basically kind of not only kind of reuse and reduce their material costs, but also see the benefits of that, both from an environmental standpoint as well as kind of the cost.
Great. I think we'll do one final question and then we'll move into breakouts. Big question from owner. Is there an overall carbon tax credit on the horizon similar to electric cars? At least, do you think the big corporations are positioning for one?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I haven't looked into so I know there's some EV credits. I don't know where that line is between the consumer and some of the corporate credits. So don't have a good answer for that, but I do know a friend of mine sent me an EV kind of credit link. I'll be sure to find that. And it basically lists off all the different credits that are available for EVs currently, and then also, I believe, ones that start in 2023. So I'll find that as well.
Excellent. And Todd, earlier you mentioned that if folks are interested in these opportunities for them to reach out to you, what would the best way be for folks to reach out to you?
Yeah, so I'm on the Work on Climate Slack pretty regularly, so feel free to DM me there, or you can send me an email, either one. And my emails should be listed on either the last page or the first page of the slides.
Yeah, and this event will be posted on our YouTube as well, so you can check it out then. So, big thank you to you, Todd, for sharing all of this wisdom with us. The conversation actually spanned, a bit of a larger scope even than industrial decarbonization. So thank you for, sharing your broader insights with us as well. We'll move into breakouts. We'll put people into rooms of 2 or 3. If the breakout's empty, just message me. It's an opportunity for you to discuss with other people what you might learn. And we'll run it for 5 more minutes past the hour, just in case folks want to stick around. But thank you all for joining, and big thank you to Todd again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.